some people coming in. Okay, thanks for coming to the Hudson Institute today. My name is Michael Pregent. I'm a senior fellow here at the Hudson Institute, and I'd like to introduce our panel. Vivian Salama will be moderating the panel today, formerly of NBC News, now with the Wall Street Journal. A lot of time in the Middle East, and she's the right person to moderate because she can hold us to our answers and poke holes in what we have to say. To my immediate left, Bilal Wahab, the Nathan and Esther K. Wagner Fellow of the Washington Institute. Always a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
Wearing the nice seersucker suit, very nice. We're going to have an all-seersucker panel one day, which would be nice. Then Ahmad Khalid Majidyar, Fellow and Director, IranObserved Project at the Middle East Institute. Thank you for being here. I'm going to hand it over to you, and we can begin.
So thank you all for joining us. I'm always happy to speak about a country that is very near to my heart, Iraq. I was AP's Iraq Bureau Chief from 2014 to 2016, so it is a place that I know well and love. For those of you who are not following the day-to-day very closely, just a quick recap. It's been about 13 weeks now since Iraq's parliamentary elections, and talks still continue, trying to sort out essentially the results, a lot of accusations of fraud and corruption surrounding the results, and those results were just certified, not changed very much from what they turned out to be during the election. And so that's basically where we stand. Iraq really trying to write the next chapter of its history, but as with many things in Iraq, it's a bumpy road. And so I'm going to ask the panelists to really just draw out on that point and see where things stand, what the options are for Iraq and for the region in general. So just generally, Mike, if you can start and maybe set things up, where do things stand today as far as the results of the parliamentary elections and the potential outcome of this?
Right. So it's my understanding, based on some of the things you've actually tweeted out there, that the election's been certified and 99% of it stayed the same, right, with few changes. Can you bring up that slide? So I like to use slides every now and then, and we're looking at government formation. Right now, we don't really have a commitment by other parties to actually join something. But if you look at who's starting to form, in my view, you're seeing Maliki's state of law, you're seeing Hadi al-Amri's Fatah coalition, and Prime Minister Abadi's Nasser alliance forming a group. And if you look at the totals there, they have 114. So they would be able to form government. They still need 165 to do it, but they would make the argument that they have the best chance to start it. And then we've seen the opposition, and it's Hikma and it's the Sarayun party. Again, Sadr came in first. Amri's party came in second. And to the surprise of most pundits in D.C. and most people that have covered this in the press, Abadi came in third. And now you're seeing a hard line in the sand with the Sadrists saying we will not form any government that includes Maliki in it, or Maliki's state of law. And the counter to that is the Fatah party, led by Hadi al-Amri and other IRGC proxies, has said we will not form any government unless Maliki is included. So you're seeing Maliki being a red line for Sadr's Sarayun party and for the Hakim's Hikma party. The issue I have, or not the issue, but the thing I'm looking at is this is not new to hear Sadr being opposed to Maliki being in government. He was opposed to Maliki in 2010, and then came over to the Maliki side. He was opposed to Maliki in 2014 and came over to Maliki's side. And of course, Hakim is movable as well. So right now we're looking at this formation. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to do a series of panels here where we continue to look at the Iraqi elections. We did one of these panels about 2 months ago. James Jeffries was on here, this panel with us. And we wanted to see how right or wrong we are. And we still don't know yet how right or wrong we are because nothing's happened. Like you said, it's been 13 weeks since the election. But what we are seeing is U.S. pressure to keep Abadi in position, and the rejection by the Sarayun party said we will not support Abadi as prime minister. He doesn't meet our requirements. He doesn't meet our, the dual citizenship issue, things like that. So right now I'm looking at government formation, and along with that, because we're focused on government formation, we don't see the protests coming. So the protesters are blaming Maliki, blaming Abadi, blaming Dawa, blaming the status quo parties for the current economic situation in Iraq, where the only person that's really immune is Sadr.
Protests are not a new phenomenon by any means. I used to see them when I was living in Baghdad all the time. But
Right.
why are they particularly significant now?
Because they're not aligned. 60% of Iraq's population is under the age of 30. And this population is looking for a relationship with the United States that's not military, that's based on education partnering, university partnering, technology, investment, things like that. And they're rejecting status quo politicians. They understand. I talk to people that have been working with the youth, and you have influencers in Iraq now that aren't aligned with political parties. They're university leaders. There are people in the economic sector. There are social media influencers, and they are rejecting the status quo politicians. Even though, for example, the Hikmah Party is reaching out to them and trying to harness this youth to get them to be part of something, you're still seeing some, not a rejection, but still questions. How are you different than everybody else? And so that's something that we're likely to see in the next 4 years. These influencers are outside of traditional political parties, form something in Iraq 4 years down the road, especially if this government formation fails.
Bilal, can you weigh in on this issue of government formation, but also add to it, please, the Kurds have been our allies in the war against ISIS. How is this impacting their situation also, their issues, their attempts for independence, and in general, how does the activities that we're seeing right now in the rest of the country impact the whole country, the one Iraq model that we knew and heard about so much a decade ago?
Sure. Thank you for your question. Thanks for being here. This map actually is quite helpful because the two models that we're faced with is whether we're going to have a unity government where all of the political parties are going to be part of, which has been the model of all governments since 2005, the first elections, and the first government in 2006, where everyone is in, so a government of everyone and therefore a government of no one. And while this form of government has been very good in terms of appeasing everyone, including everyone, both sectarian and partisan inclusion, just by the virtue of being a unity government. On one hand, it has been based on sectarian and partisan patronage, and therefore some economic trickle down has been happening through these political parties, where masses of the population end up working for the government, and therefore, instead of being part of a social security network, they're part of a patronage network where people get paid by being police officers, being teachers, being bureaucrats. So on the other hand, this also has basically given us no opposition. And therefore, everyone was in it. Everyone was sort of milking the cow, which is the government coffers. And this form of government lasted so far, but then it has received some serious blows in the recent history, in the recent past. One was this system, while it was good on the short term and good in terms of including everyone and appeasing everyone, could not provide security for the country. And within weeks, ISIS managed to capture a third of the country. So having these masses of armed forces, despite well-equipped and American weapons, you did not have the software, the unity, the command and control structure in the military to be able to withstand a few thousand fighters on the back of pickup trucks. On the other hand, and this goes back to the question of protests, this form of government, of everyone in it, and therefore no one leading it and no one taking ownership and accountability inside this government, that kind of form of government is able to hire a police officer and hire a teacher, or put 5 people for the same job, but it cannot offer services, it cannot offer good governance, it cannot offer the kind of big national projects that result in better roads, electricity, less bureaucracy, fight corruption. So not being able to deliver in terms of governance. What we have in front of us today is a public that is very angry at this lack of services, at weak governance, at corruption on one hand. They don't know Saddam Hussein, as you mentioned, 60% of the population is under 30. So this whole idea of, you have to be happy because now the Shia is ruling Iraq, or the Kurds are ruling, that kind of identity politics that has been enough until today doesn't really fly anymore. The public want services, they want jobs, they want the opportunities of any other neighbor that they have living in a petrostate, a rich country with poor people. So this form of government does not deliver that. The options of the election, in a way, give us, on the one hand, the option of another unity government, which will be continuation of the status quo, or perhaps, and this is what we're seeing, some part of the ruling elite, of the ruling coalitions, actually becoming opposition. So we may actually have, for the first time since 2005, a serious opposition. And that would be putting Iraq actually on a different trajectory and probably closer to political maturity. The second part of your question, very briefly, I think the Kurds are, in a way, bystanders, because this is mainly about intra-Shia rivalry. It's about who within the Shia house is going to be the core of the next government. Again, looking back at the chart that Mike drew. And then they're willing for the Shia to make up their act, and then they're going to join that government, because in the perspective of the Kurds, it's being in Baghdad, being part of the government, going back to regaining some of those positions like the presidency, the vice, deputy prime minister, and some of those positions in Baghdad is necessary for the Kurdish leadership. They're not kingmakers anymore. They're not going to change the scale as they once used to. And they're trying to reintegrate politically and economically after the referendum of last year that did not result in furthering the Kurdish aspirations for independence. So those are probably brief answers to.
And so to kind of rewind a little bit, essentially what we're saying here is that the victories against extremism, against ISIS that we saw from the Prime Minister Abadi's administration only goes so far. People want jobs, people want, the basic things that people everywhere around the world want, and those victories, they got old fast.
Well, that's right. I mean, yes, the victory against ISIS was huge, was tremendous. I mean, obviously, the Prime Minister
also temporary.
Exactly. Right. Well, we're going to probably
get into that
as well.
Get into that.
Sorry, how permanent the victory against ISIS is, or how sustainable the liberation of ISIS-controlled territories are going to be. But in the eyes of, and again, he named his coalition the Nasr coalition, which is the victory coalition. He was trying to basically cash in on the fact that he led Iraq, through liberating and defeating ISIS on one hand, and also defeating the Kurdish effort at independence. Right. But the election results show that that's not the priority of the Iraqi people, because if you're an Iraqi, the whole capture of a third of the country by ISIS in the first place was a mistake. So all, in the eyes of the Iraqis, all that Abadi did was correct a mistake rather than achieve a victory. And the day today, and again, let's just be clear, it's August. The temperatures are above 100, 110 Fahrenheit. And living in Basra, where your city accounts for 80% of your country's revenues, and not having fresh water to drink and not having electricity, in a way, protest is probably the only other thing that you can do. Right. And the other challenge that puts people on the street is they look into the political lineup, and they look at the parties, they look at the faces. Nothing really is changing. So there is no guarantee that the future, that tomorrow is going to be better than yesterday. People want to move on, while the parties want to cash in on their achievements. Some of them are visible, such as defeating ISIS, but what touches people's life on a daily basis, the bloated bureaucracy, it takes months to get a driver's license, gets months to get a birth certificate. Anytime you go to a government office, they say, come back tomorrow. That's sort of the default answer. And then again, the basic services of not having a banking sector, not having the quality of the education is low. Many of the schools have to have 3 shifts of schooling because there are not enough school buildings for children. These are all things that Iraqis see as a paradox of being the second largest OPEC member on the one hand, and yet not having sweet, fresh water to drink.
Very important points. Ahmad, I have a question for you, but before I do, I also forgot to thank our friends at C-SPAN who are here taping this, and we have an audience watching C-SPAN today as well, joining us. So we thank you for being with us. Ahmed, something that Bilal said, he said about this inter-Shia rivalry right now that's going on in this race. Immediately, the question then becomes, what is Tehran's role in this whole entire thing? We know, of course, you hear that Tehran wants to influence Iraq, but explain how it influences Iraq and what is the best avenues for it? Why does it want to today? What benefit is there?
The Iranian influence permeates all segments of the Iraqi security and politics. And I remember that the first event that we had here, and that was prior to the elections, I said that Tehran does not play the Russian roulette game in Iraq, putting all its eggs in one basket. It plays the French roulette, which it puts money on almost all numbers. So whichever number is lucky, it has a stake there. So when the elections happened, Muqtada Sadr's Syrian coalition came first. A majority of pundits here described that as a failure of Iran and thought that perhaps Iranian influence will be diminished in Iraq significantly. But
if Sadr were to take over.
Yeah, but Iran never saw it that way. It understood that it has its allies even within the Syrian coalition. The Fatah coalition, which is a coalition of Iranian-backed militia forces, which are part of the Popular Mobilization Forces, they came second. They got 47, now 48 seats, actually. So it knew that it had the veto power in the government formation in Iraq, and it will also force the Fatah alliance in the next government, one way or another. And it largely succeeded. And since the election, it has also reached out to beyond just even Shiites. It has gone to different, to the Sunnis. It has also reached out to the Kurds. Interestingly, a lot of Iranian officials, when they, in their meetings with the Kurdish officials, they tell them that we guarantee you greater autonomy, but you have to work closely with our allies, particularly the Fatah alliance in Baghdad. So for the Kurds, it's a difficult decision because they are, of course, very much disappointed with what Tehran did to them, particularly during referendum. But they failed in the referendum. The United States did not back it, nor did any other regional government. So some of those Kurdish leaders are now amenable to Tehran's offer to achieve some of their aspirations, particularly the PUK and others. So the point I'm trying to make is that Iran has reached out to different segments of the Iraqi society. So no matter what kind of coalition government comes into place, Iran will have a major stake in it.
What about Prime Minister Abadi? What was that relationship like, and what is it like now?
Prime Minister Abadi had tried to balance Iraq's relations with Tehran and Washington, mostly successfully, because there was a common enemy in ISIS that had brought Iran and the United States together, or at least that they were not in conflict with each other. But now that common enemy is gone. So we already see that Prime Minister Abadi is having problem just keeping that balance. For example, as the US withdrew from the nuclear deal and also the imposed sanctions, that put Prime Minister Abadi in a very difficult position, because he initially said that we would abide by the sanctions. We don't have any other choice, although we oppose it. But later, he had to walk back from those comments because all Iraqi allies, whether it was the militia commanders or whether it was major politicians, including Sadr, including leader of Hikmah or Wisdom Party, Al-Hakim, they all went to Tehran's side, which shows Iran's growing influence in that country.
Right. Well, with all of this now as the backdrop to the most recent events taking place, obviously something that we've been talking about for years now is the rise and fall of ISIS, or Daesh, as we call it in Iraq. So I encourage any of you to jump in now. I want you to be more casual about our interactions in terms of the United Nations this week just put out a report talking about a grave resurgence of ISIS, whereas we have President Trump here talking about ISIS being defeated. So what is the circumstances now with ISIS, and is Iraq and its neighbors, are they prepared to confront another resurgence?
So what's interesting about ISIS and this campaign to defeat ISIS, and this, we destroyed Fallujah twice when the U.S. was in Iraq, and at no time did we claim victory over Al-Qaeda in Fallujah. This has been a campaign where it's many phases, but this is phase one, taking away territory. We've simply taken away territory by destroying infrastructure, destroying 80% of Ramadi, destroying 50% of West Mosul, and basically calling it victory against something that is now something that has been operating in the Al-Qaeda model now for almost a year and a half. There was an Iraqi general from the emergency response divisions from the Ministry of Interior who said that he estimates the total number of ISIS fighters in Iraq at 1,000 to 4,000 spread out. Then you have the UN report that says somewhere between 30 and 40,000 ISIS fighters between Iraq and Syria. So if you cut that in half using Middle East math, it's 10,000 to 15,000 between the two places. But Al-Qaeda was never more than 4,000 in Iraq during the height of the insurgency when the U.S. was there, yet they were able to wreak havoc. ISIS has learned that unless you can shoot down U.S. aircraft, don't plant a black flag and don't claim you own territory, because you will lose it. They are now in the Al-Qaeda model. Anytime you Google any city in Iraq, you can find an ISIS attack. And I've seen several of my colleagues have actually done studies about the resurgence of ISIS in Salahuddin and Diyala and Mosul itself. And ISIS is now looking for that high value target, that high payoff target in Baghdad that sends a message that they're still there. That same target in Damascus, that same ability to retake territory. The only way you kill ISIS is by empowering Sunnis to reject it, by having Sunni trust of their government, and it's just something that we're not seeing in Baghdad. Again, 97% of the security forces, they may not be sectarian, but they are Shia. And the ones that have primacy in the Ministry of Interior and the Hashid al-Shabi are Badr Corps aligned or IRGC Quds Force aligned. These aren't, the Sariyun militias, Sadr's militias are actually the ones that the government's trying to disarm.
Well, I mean, Bilal just beautifully detailed some of the economic issues that are taking place on the street in Iraq. Wasn't that a big reason that a lot of people joined ISIS in the first place? The government couldn't provide services and all of these other issues. So, are we going full circle?
Yeah, we've reset the conditions that led to ISIS to begin with. You have a more disenfranchised population. Even with the Shia South, they believe they are disenfranchised as well. I'm not saying that ISIS is going to rise and bust, but what I am saying that the Sunni population of Iraq, Sunni Kurd, Sunni Arab, are more distrustful of Baghdad now than ever. And you simply have reset the conditions that led to ISIS to begin with. Again, with that added caveat that ISIS now knows that they cannot roll in, plant flags, hold public executions without the ability to be able to shoot down American aircraft.
Please.
Just wanted to add that that number in itself is significant, although that shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody who's closely watching Syria and Iraq. But even more important than that number is that now the terrorism issue or challenge in Iraq is even more complicated and difficult to counter than it was before. Now, of course, ISIS does not control that territory that it controlled before, at one point up to 40% of Iraq. But now it has sleeper cells. It still has its infrastructure in different parts of Iraq. They are invisible during the day, but at night they continue their campaign of assassination, kidnapping, taking ransom from people, and intimidating officials and tribal leaders and others. So now it's the onus on the Iraqi security forces and their international allies to go and find them and dismantle those cells. And that's much more difficult challenge than even it was before. And I agree with Mike that although the level of violence has decreased significantly, and ISIS has lost territorial control. But the underlying challenges that led to the rise of ISIS or resurgence of ISIS, if we see ISIS as a successor of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, then most of them, they are still there. And the government doesn't have the willingness and at times capacity to deal with them.
Well, and I want to talk about, you said the allies have been a big driving force in the counter-ISIS campaign to help Iraq. President Trump has made it clear he wants out. Iran is suffering an economic crisis right now. So where do we stand in terms of, if there is a legitimate resurgence, how are we going to face it when the U.S. is very reluctant to get involved again? And you tell me, is Iran capable of providing the support that it did 2 years ago, 3 years ago?
Well, the Iraqi security forces, by no means, despite some of the progress that they've made over the past years as a result of the training and assistance mission of the coalition forces, they're still in no position to defend Iraq on their own. We saw that what happened after the abrupt withdrawal of the U.S. troops under the Obama administration. So the hope is that the Trump administration has learned from that mistake and does not leave Iraq precipitously in a way that creates that vacuum that leads to another type of ISIS 2.0 or 3.0. And that will happen because those, again, the main reasons that whether it's sectarianism, whether it's poverty, whether it's, and the problem in Iraq is not just between the Sunnis and Shias. People usually just simplify that. Within communities, between tribes, even between Sunnis, there are differences. There are families in Mosul, for example, that they have left because just their neighbors somehow sided with ISIS. So now they're returning to there. So that the country needs healing. The country needs a reconciliation. The country needs a very comprehensive stabilization and reconstruction processes. And that is what the Trump administration, I think, that helps. But most importantly, I think that it needs to keep troops in Iraq for the long haul until the Iraqi security forces are able to police their borders on their own. And when it comes to Iran, the Iranian-backed militia forces, they have a history of violence against some of the communities inside Iraq. And they were the main reason behind some of the Sunni communities reluctantly joining the ISIS at the first place. Although they have now shifted, changed their kind of outlook, and even softened their tones and threats, and they've become more politicians. But in reality, their forces are just the same forces. So if you leave things to them, things could exacerbate. That's not an enduring solution.
I'll just add to this conversation about security and tie it back to the previous points about governance, but also the question of KRG-Baghdad relations. In terms of politics in Baghdad, as I mentioned earlier, I think the Kurdish leadership is waiting to go back to Baghdad and try to unite, because there are a lot of issues at home with the KRG elections being scheduled for end of September on one hand. So while participation in Baghdad requires a level of unity to go in with one voice, having elections at home requires naturally competition and rivalry. So that is sort of one area where the Kurdish orientation is not very clear, other than, yes, we are going back to Baghdad. But when it comes to this question of security, I think this is the most crucial area where KRG-Baghdad cooperation is necessary. It's become very clear that ISIS, as an insurgency, is trying to capitalize the grievances of the population, especially in the disputed territories. So what do? For example, we talked about lack of electricity and services. They went in Kirkuk, Salahuddin, and Diyala areas, and they basically bombed down electricity towers just to stoke greater disenfranchisement and anger at the government. The other thing they do is they try to stoke political disputes. In Kirkuk, they went and they tried to attack the headquarters of IHEC, where the ballots, while the recount was going on, are being stored. So we try basically to put a hole in the whole electoral process and further delegitimize an already questionable election. And the other thing they do is they try to stoke Arab-Kurdish tensions by doing attacks on both sides and trying to make it sound as if these are, the Peshmerga and the Iraqi sides are fighting each other. And again, the issue of tribes also came up because sometimes we've seen violence between popular mobilization forces that usually come from outside these territories and tribal forces on the ground. We've seen actually clashes between these two groups. And then sometimes they actually come and do killings. They try to blame it on one side in order to stoke this kind of internal conflicts. So in a way, they're playing a very dirty game, to say the least. And this is where cooperation is necessary. If ISIS is playing this kind of dirty games, and the KRG and Baghdad are still distrustful of each other, and they refuse to have joint security operations, which actually was one of the main mechanisms that they managed to secure many of the disputed territories in the past, we need to have that level of cooperation, that kind of joint security cooperation, which, by the way, the United States mediated at the time of defeating Al-Qaeda. So that level is definitely necessary. Maybe at the political level, it's very difficult for KRG and Baghdad to see eye to eye in terms of Kurdish participation in the government, revenue sharing, the question of oil and gas, the very question of disputed territories itself. But when it comes to security in the disputed territories, I think neither Baghdad nor the KRG alone can manage security. They need to cooperate.
What about the national forces that were supposed to be plucked from the Sunni tribes in these various places? I mean, when I was based in Iraq, they used to haul us out into the desert and to see the training of these forces. Americans would be there to help support that training. We know that an attempt to do a similar force in 2007, 2008 failed. Where do we stand on that now, and especially in light of these developments?
So the failure of 2007, 2008, the surge, the Sons of Iraq, the Sahwa, was they were never incorporated into the Iraqi security forces. They were dismantled. They were on contracted temporary securities, a temporary security force that was on contract that we handed over to Maliki. And we started seeing, I was an intelligence officer at the time, and I was dealing with Maliki's government on how to reconcile with the Sunnis and how to bring the Sons of Iraq into the security forces. And we started seeing intel that Maliki was actually targeting their leaders and going after them. And it's very difficult when you're talking to a general about what the prime minister is doing when that general has a face-to-face with that prime minister at a dinner or the next morning. And it was very challenging to get intel in front of a general when the general would simply say, I had dinner with him last night. He said he's not doing that. And that's a very difficult situation. So we saw the dismantling of the Sons of Iraq, and now this attempt to do a Sons of Iraq light, or an awakening, a light version of it, by bringing reporters out to an air base south of Ramadi to show that Sunnis are now part of the security forces. At the same time, there were posters inside those military bases of Kitab Hezbollah, Sabah al-Haq, other leaders. And it was an intimidation to Sunnis that were coming. They were getting off buses, they were going into these camps and seeing somebody that they know as part of a militia with a very close relationship to a U.S. soldier. And when I say that is, we briefed the 82nd Airborne Division before they went into Baghdad in 2014, and we asked them, how many of you have been to Iraq before? If you think about this, the last time we did combat operations was really 2009. The June out of cities where everybody went back to bases. So we've lost we've lost the expertise. So when we asked this force, the 82nd Airborne Division Brigade, how many of you have been to Iraq before? Only the senior leadership raised their hands. Nobody at the captain level, at the staff sergeant, basically nobody who was actually training the Iraqi security forces had ever been to Iraq before. And they didn't know who they were training. And those of us who were in the intel community that actually was looking at the Iraqi security forces and the militias saw that they are training a militia force. They are training Hashd al-Shabi that are heavily tied to the IRGC Quds force. And
Hashd al-Shabi, of course, the popular mobilization.
And that was one of our biggest problems, because you would have people like Qais Ghazali, leader of AAH, and others say that we can wear any uniform in the Iraqi security forces we want to. And the Iranians learned something a long time ago, that they had an assassination campaign against Iraqi pilots regardless of their sect. Didn't matter if they were Shia, Christian, or Sunni. If they had the capability to fly a U.S. jet, They were a threat. So they had an assassination campaign led by Qasem Soleimani to kill Iraqi pilots. And now, if you look at who's receiving specialized training to fly American jets, to drive American tanks, they are highly vetted, and they are people that will either side with Badr Corps or be part of a system. I just have an issue with that. We are basically training a military where IRGC Quds Force militias have primacy. And I'm not talking about the popular mobilization units. I'm talking about Badr Corps. Badr Corps has ownership of key positions in the Iraqi security forces. And Hadi al-Amri just came in second in an election. He is the Badr Corps commander. And its
leader, General Soleimani, had been spotted here and there in Iraq and in Kirkuk recently.
If we had that kind of intelligence in 2007, where we were able to see Qasem Soleimani actually being on the ground, we were more comfortable with him coming in for a secret meeting, more comfortable with him being some part of a coffee shop conversation in a Sunni neighborhood. And now you see him leading victory parades after.
People running up to him, taking selfies.
Running up and taking selfies. You couldn't have asked for this treasure trove of intel of Iranian influence that you have now that's actually being ignored. This is what we were looking for in 2007, and now it's out there in front of our faces, and we're doing everything we can to ignore it.
How well has the administration here, Ahmed, a question for you, how well has the sitting administration of Prime Minister Abadi done to avoid those retaliatory retribution attacks that were so feared? I remember going into Tikrit right after it was liberated, and there was Farsi graffiti all over the walls of, obviously Saddam Hussein's hometown. So there was a personal vendetta a little bit there, but that was the biggest fear, and the concern was that if the Shia militias were not formally integrated into the military, then it was going to go wild. Do you think that it has been managed well enough that Iran's influence in the military elements of it has been controlled, or are we seeing basically the start of potential attacks and potential?
Sure. If briefly, just before issues. That, if I can just add to something Please. Mike said about the local Sunni forces. Even some Sunni units within the popular mobilization forces, after the fight against ISIS was over, their numbers have dwindled. Many of them have gone back to their civilian life. Some of them have been integrated into security forces. But even within the security forces is the Badr organization, Asayb Ahl al-Haq, and other Shia organizations that have the prominent role. So if the security situation becomes worse in Iraq, and if there's need to send back these forces to those communities, these Sunni militia forces are not in place. So again, the government has to send the Shia forces there, which could exacerbate the sectarian tension. But coming back to your question about whether the inclusion or integration of the popular mobilization forces has diminished Iran's influence in Iraqi security, I would argue that that has increased, actually, Iran's influence, because Iran is suffering, first of all, economic problems. So it would have had problem to just pay the salaries of those militia forces if it had to keep them after the fight against ISIS. We already see inside Iran that the protesters come and chant against the regime's very expensive involvement in Iraq, Syria, and elsewhere. So by integrating these forces within the Iraqi security forces, on the one hand, Iran has expanded its influence, and secondly, also it has removed that the monetary and financial burden from Iran, because they get the salary from Baghdad, but they serve mostly just the Iranian interest. So that is actually, I would argue that, I don't know what my colleagues think, but I would argue that has increased Iranian influence within the military.
30 seconds on that. Iran is looking to offset U.S. sanctions in Iraq. They've already established penetration of Iraq's economic sectors and their corporate infrastructure to do just that, to be able to offset U.S. sanctions. So, in your question earlier, will Iran's situation decrease its activities in Iraq? It actually makes it more necessary to have activities in Iraq to be able to offset that. And that's what I would say to that.
What about the Iraqi military's recent attacks against ISIS strongholds in Syria? I mean, how does that factor into everything we just discussed?
I've looked at this, and the ISIS targets have been put in quotations because they're not ISIS targets.
Okay.
They are the Sunni opposition. So it's the same kind of
Here
thing.
first, folks.
It's kind of the same thing that you saw in Iraq. Again, our administration said that we've killed 50,000 ISIS fighters in Iraq. There were never more than 10 to 15,000 ISIS fighters in Iraq at the start of the campaign, through the campaign. ISIS works on a billet system. Somebody dies, they fill the billet. They were paying $500 a month salary, a cell phone, and a car in Mosul in 2014. And then quickly, after a year of operations, dwindled that down to $50 a month. And you were being conscripted into those positions to fill billets that had expired because people were killed, or people fled, or ISIS killed them themselves. The Iraqi Air Force is targeting assets in Syria using the same thing that Assad says. It's doing the same thing that Iran says. That they are targeting, and I'm going to say something nice here after this, that they are targeting Sunnis, or targeting ISIS. But I would argue that Iraq should have the best intel on where ISIS fighters are in Iraq, because the core group around Baghdadi was Iraqi. There was an attempt by Qais Khazali of AH to try to get Baghdadi before the election in order to demonstrate a capability to do things. So I would say that Iraqi intel should be able to pinpoint Baghdadi. We've seen reports recently that he's been injured and that he can no longer leave the movement. And as an intelligence officer, you're always in this situation. If an intelligence organization is wrong 90% of the time, and then they're right the one time, do you find yourself discarding what they said? And we're doing that. We're just discarding what Iraqi intel is saying about the death of Baghdadi because they've been wrong 90% of the time. Same thing happened in Afghanistan. Afghan intel said we know where Osama bin Laden is, and 97% of the time they were wrong. However, they did also say he was at Abbottabad, because they were wrong 97% of the time. Yeah.
I have a quick question for Bilal, but before I get to that, what about Al-Qaeda? Where do we stand on Al-Qaeda now? Is there a resurgence? That was what the UN report suggested. Do any of you have thoughts on that? Are we seeing any substantial Al-Qaeda presence that can be distinguished from ISIS?
I would just say that ISIS would take anybody into the organization, and Jabhat al-Nusra, they wanted to actually have Al-Qaeda type qualifications, meaning you have to be versed in the ideology, you have to have skills, you have to have tactics. So I would say that if there is an Al-Qaeda resurgence, and it doesn't matter how big it is, they will be smarter. They will be the ones that have the skills and the relationships. One of the biggest problems with ISIS is there was no consistency across the governance, across the wadis. There was so much competition. The Iraqis insulated Baghdadi from meeting with other groups, other ISIS members from other countries. Al-Qaeda doesn't do that. Al-Qaeda wants somebody who's qualified to do things. So if they do have a resurgence, yes, but I don't put them in the 30,000 to 50,000 number that the UN came out with. I put them in, they are assessing talent. This is something that if you look at the Osama bin Laden exploitation documents, Osama bin Laden said, go to Syria and find out who the talent is and bring the talent into the organization. They want leaders, charismatic leaders that can actually move people and do things. And that's who they're looking for. They are better at vetting individuals than ISIS was.
Okay. Please, Ahmed. Yeah.
Just very quickly to add that when we talk about Al-Qaeda presence in Iraq, if we mean by Al-Qaeda core, which is now run by Zawahiri, it does not have any significant presence in Iraq. And based on my own talks with Iraqi officials, they don't see that as a major threat. But let's also take into account that the Al-Qaeda organization has decentralized over the past years. So there are smaller organizations and small franchises inside Iraq that have some sort of affiliation and cooperation with Al-Qaeda. So they are their affiliates. And the Iraqi government, they're not very much concerned about whether it's Al-Qaeda or whether it's ISIS. They understand that the ideology is there, and also that the conditions can help them to research is still there. So whether it's ISIS or Al-Qaeda, for them, it's just those extremists that take different names at different times.
Sure. I mean, the reason, and just to clarify, the reason I'm asking for those who don't follow it closely is there is a significant ideological break between the two, where Al-Qaeda spoke out against ISIS going after Shias, because they said they're Muslims and you shouldn't do that. And so, in Syria, we've seen them go at it with each other and really take each other on. So it would be another element to a really complicated security landscape.
Al-Qaeda senior leadership was against what Zarqawi was doing in Iraq. The Golden Mosque bombing, the brutality displayed against other Sunnis, and there's some conversation within behind walls with no windows that because Zarqawi was so out of control and wasn't listening to Osama bin Laden and key leadership, that maybe that was some of the reasons we were able to target Zarqawi to begin with.
Right.
And ISIS has been as brutal as Zarqawi. They are actually known as, coming from the Zarqawi movement of Al-Qaeda, to be able to target Sunnis, target Shias, foment sectarian strife, do these things. And I think that's the difference. Al-Qaeda has a slower method to what they're doing, and ISIS just says, come one, come all, let's go do this. And that's why you saw foreign fighters join ISIS when it was having successes, but not reinforce it when it was being defeated.
Right. Bilal, talk to us about Peshmerga, the Iraqi Kurdish forces. Who are their friends right now? Is the Trump administration helping them out? Are they in a position that they could defend the Kurdish region if there is a resurgence? Uh-oh. Hey, your silence is deafening.
Yeah, they are. I mean, okay, so the Kurdish Peshmerga, the structural problem with the Kurdish Peshmerga is that they're partisan.
Right.
Okay? Their command and control, their loyalty are to the
Wait, you mean all the Kurds are not loyal to just one leader? Please.
No. Factionalism is probably our sports in Kurdistan.
Right.
I'm not sure. I think some 40 parties have registered for the September elections.
Right.
Like 40 parties in a small region.
Kid, of course.
Yeah. And yet the power structure has been the same since 1992. So I guess there's a business of being in a political party in Kurdistan, but that's a different conversation.
Both a strength and weakness. So.
Yes. But the challenge with the Peshmerga is these are the fighters that came down from the mountains. Where the party and the Peshmerga were sort of two faces of the same coin. They formed the government in 1992. They fought the civil war in 1994. And although the PUK and the KDP have been the government, are the government, they have refused to surrender their own Peshmerga to their own government. And this has been the challenge of governance in Kurdistan. One of the main structural challenges of governance in Kurdistan. Now, this does not mean that they're not effective, because they've been very effective in protecting Kurdistan from ISIS. They've been very effective in participating and being a member of the coalition against ISIS. They've actually had better command and control structure and following orders from their leaders. In the Battle of Mosul, in the helping out with the coordinating with the U.S. forces, coordinating with the Iraqi security forces in liberating Mosul, for example. So they're effective, but are they a force for protecting all of Kurdistan, or do they remain partisan? The recent events, 2014 when ISIS came, the Peshmerga alone could not defend Kurdistan. They needed Iranian help, first of all, and then later American help. So as an army that is able to defend Kurdistan alone, that was put to test, and I don't think that they passed that test. And then fast forward last year, after the referendum, October of last year, when the Iraqi military attacked them in Kirkuk and in Mahmur in Mosul province, the Kurdish Peshmerga either did not put up a fight with the Iraqi security forces because they didn't want to, or chances are, the Peshmerga is no match for the Iraqi security forces with all of their air power and the American Abrams tanks.
They were told not to as well.
So that's why. Did they choose not to fight, or were they no match for the Iraqi security forces? And I think there's a bit of both. Again, just not having an air force in itself is an imbalance of power for the vis-a-vis the Iraqi security forces. So then what is the proper role of the Peshmerga? The proper role of the Peshmerga is to protect Kurdistan and do that protection. So when it comes to security and policing, they have been very capable. In fact, in terms of policing and security, even more definitely more capable than the Iraqi security forces. For example, Kirkuk was a lot safer when the Kurdish Peshmerga was controlling it than when the Iraqi security forces were. There were like some 40 car bombs in a month. When the Iraqi security forces were in charge of Kirkuk, and that basically came down to naught when the Kurdish Peshmerga was in charge of Kirkuk. So they're very good with internal security. As a defense force against an outside force, they have proved to be less capable. When it comes to internal Kurdish politics, this duopoly of power, the PUK, KDP duopoly of power, and the fact that the reform in the KRG has been so difficult also emerges from the fact that the Kurdish Peshmerga is not Kurdistan's national army. They can act like Kurdistan's national army. So for example, against ISIS, the United States created incentives for some units within the Peshmerga to unite by saying that the United States is only going to fund and arm brigades within the Peshmerga that report to the government and not to the political party. And that was incentive enough for the KRG, for the two parties, to unite some brigades and put them under the KRG's command. But as soon as that incentive was gone, these brigades basically went to their home bases, to their partisan home bases. And that's the challenge for reform in Kurdistan, because when the political parties that are in power feel threatened, they have the wherewithals to coerce the opposition. And we see this often after elections, during elections, before elections. When a party feels threatened, then they basically bring back their troops from the front lines and they use it against an opposition party. So this is the challenge for the future of Kurdistan politically, but also security. I think these two incidents, the October 2017 after the referendum vis-a-vis the Iraqi army, and 2014 vis-a-vis ISIS, should be a wake-up call that yes, the Kurdish Peshmerga is going to be loyal to the parties and to the Kurdish leadership, but at least it's time to formalize them under the KRG command and control, so the KRG actually be treated as a legal and better representative of the Kurdish people by having an army that's actually responsible and accountable to the government and not to some Politburo or to some political leader.
How would you describe right now the complicated relationship between the Kurdish government and Turkey?
Oh, it's very complicated, and we cannot just talk about it in terms of the Kurdish and the Kurdish government and the Turkish government. Right. Because when it comes to the relations with Turkey or relations with Iran, for that matter, right, we have to then get a level deeper. Which party, which Kurds are we talking about? For example, the KDP, the Kurdistan Democratic Party, which is the largest party in Kurdistan. They're in charge of the government right now because the prime minister is from that party, and they control 2 of the 3 provinces. They have better relations with Turkey than the PUK, the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan. In fact, Turkish airlines, while they fly to Erbil, they don't fly to Sulaymaniyah because the Turkish government accuses the PUK of supporting the PKK and the PKK offshoots in Syria, the PYD and the YPG. So that was enough of a grievance for Turkey not to ban Turkish airline flights to Sulaymaniyah. And then on the other hand, because the parties in Sulaymaniyah, broadly speaking, or the PUK, feels that it has lost the balance of power vis-a-vis the KDP, they have this relationship with the PKK because it's one way of balancing the KDP's power. So internally, the question of sort of transnational Kurdish relations also plays into KRG politics itself. But broadly speaking, there is a general commitment from both sides that KRG proper should not be used as a base for either the PKK to attack Turkey or for the Iranian Kurdish opposition parties, which have been increasingly active, to use the KRG as a base to attack Iran. Because these two countries, not only theoretically, but as we saw after the referendum, practically can hurt the KRG, can squeeze it economically. They can, as we saw, Tehran and Ankara allied with the Iraqi government against Kurdistan after the referendum. So these neighbors, while they can be friendly, like Turkey has been friendly to the KRG by allowing independent oil exports, by never shutting down the borders, by being a lifeline for exit and access to the international community, they can come together and they can hurt Kurdistan when they cross a line that they put for them. And Iran, that's also true for Iran. Yesterday, 2 days ago, Turkish jets bombarded Sinjar, the town of Sinjar, because they were targeting some actually Iraqi groups that are on Iraqi government payroll and part of the Popular Mobilization Forces, but they are an offshoot of the PKK called the Yabasha. Iran, on the other hand, bombards the villages and Iraqi villages at the Iran-Iraq border every now and then under the pretext of fighting terrorism, fighting their own opposition groups, under the guise of security. So Kurdistan is quite vulnerable. They also need to do this delicate dance of maintaining relationships on the one hand, and yet not being seen as anti-Kurdish by being against these Kurdish opposition groups that operate in that area.
Well, and I suppose that was the missing piece to target a specific question for all of you, which is Kirkuk. We saw recently, again, General Soleimani was there. And there was concern that some of the Shia militias would make a run for Kirkuk because of its oil wealth. And so in the grander discussion of the political landscape, the fight over resources in Iraq, what is the situation today with Kirkuk? And is there any discussion of that in the midst of all of this, the parliamentary issues as well?
Kirkuk is so we have a constitutional article, Article 140 of the Constitution, that specifically puts a roadmap to settle the disputed territories. And while it's called disputed territories because Kirkuk is not the only one, but it's definitely the sore thumb there. The process in the Constitution is simple, has 3 phases. I should not say simple.
On paper, it's simple, maybe.
That's why I immediately corrected myself. I should never use simple and Iraq in the same sentence ever again. That's a mistake.
But if you use complicated, we never do anything about it.
How about complex?
All right. Well, I'd argue complex as well,
Okay.
but yes.
So the Constitution put a roadmap. Neither the Iraqi side, so when it was under the Iraqi government's prerogative to implement the Constitution, okay, so the 3 phases would be normalization. What basically means is that people who were forcibly forced out of these disputed territories should be able to come back. People who were forcibly brought in should be returned to their provinces. 2, a census, so we know who is there and how many people. And by the way, last time Iraq had a census was like 50, 60 years ago. So knowledge and transparency is a very dangerous thing in Iraq because
displacements make census more
right. Because if you ask Iraqis, the Shia are 70% and the Sunnis are 60% and the Kurds are 105%. So that amounts to some sort of magical number, and no one wants to know because if you know, then again, knowledge can be dangerous. So anyways, census, and then the final stage would be a referendum where you ask the people in these provinces, where do they want to be? Do they want to be part of Iraq? Do they want to be part of Kurdistan? Do they want to be independent? This never happened. It had actually an expiration date as well. So there's always this debate between, this blame game between KRG and Baghdad, who's responsible for implementing the Constitution. I think that's a question that no one has an answer for yet. Someone described the Constitution as being an aspirational document. But what has replaced the constitutional and the legal process has been politics, has been basically status quo. The Iraqi government said, we're here, the deadline passed, and therefore there's no need for a referendum. I mean, that was basically Prime Minister Maliki's attitude. And then after ISIS attack and there was a vacuum left, and then the Kurdish Peshmerga forces went and took Kirkuk, because it was basically whether the Peshmerga will take it or ISIS will take it. So they protected Kirkuk, and the Kurdish Peshmerga has been in control of Kirkuk from 2014 until October 2016. And then what did the Kurds say? They didn't say, okay, we have an opportunity now to actually implement the Constitution and do steps 1, 2, 3. They said, no need for the Constitution. We're here, and this is the implementation of the Constitution. And then when there was a referendum for independence, Kirkuk was included as if there is no constitutional article that talks about normalization, census, and referendum. So Kirkuk was included in the referendum. That obviously angered not only Baghdad, but of course Turkey as well. And now the Iraqi government military is back, and they say, all right, we're here now. So this game of I'm here and therefore I am right, and might makes right, has really proven unstable. And we need, I hope that the Iraqi leadership and the Kurdish leadership realize that they need to sit down and negotiate and actually settle this on more solid ground. And by the way, this point also applies to the question of oil and gas management and revenue management. Again, when the Kurdish forces were in Kirkuk, they were taking Kirkuk's oil. When the Iraqi government is in Kirkuk, they're taking Kirkuk's oil. And all of a sudden, it doesn't matter that the constitution says that oil and gas is a property of all the people of Iraq. So this game of balance of power has been played over and over again. It has resulted in more instability. And yet, the people of Kirkuk actually continue to suffer from violence, from lack of jobs, from lack of services. Security
degradation, the resurgence of ISIS, and now it's come to the point where the Iraqi security forces and also the Hashid al-Shabi, primarily Assad al-Haq,
too many cooks,
are there, and they're not able to secure it. What we've learned about Iraq over the last 15 years is that the only people that are capable of providing security are people from that area that know the back streets, that know the tribes, that know the people. And we continue to think that the Iraqi army is a national military where you can move one unit from Maysan province into Nineveh province and then be effective. The Peshmerga learned that when they were in Mosul. And that's why they didn't want to take part in the Mosul operations, because they would be rejected by the majority of the Sunni population there. During this ISIS campaign and during our actual time in Iraq since the beginning, we never empowered local forces to provide local security and understood that that's how the Iraqi security forces work. Much like the Peshmerga, they can defend locally. They can defend territory that they're tied to through tribes, tied to from some political issue or some vendetta. They can do that. They can go into Tikrit and hold it. They have to be willing to fight and die in Mosul. And that's why in 2014, the predominantly Shia leadership of the 2nd Iraqi Army Division said, I'm not willing to die in Mosul. I'm going to fall back to Baghdad, and the forces went away. They blended back into the population. There's security degradation in Iraq because now we're talking about politics. We're talking about politics as though the security situation is stable. It's not stable, especially in the areas that ISIS control. But there's a new dynamic here. When we talk about the Trump administration and talk about Iraq policy, I focus on how do we get administrations to put something concrete in place that doesn't go away when the next president comes in. Something that prevents 10-year-old Americans from fighting in Iraq when they're 20-year-olds. And I see 10-year-old Americans fighting in Iraq when they're 20-year-olds, again, against the next iteration of ISIS or Al-Qaeda with a Syria dynamic in that Baghdad won't invite us in, that we have to go in because there's an existential threat in Iraq that keeps emerging, that we have to go in and Baghdad, if these parties take hold, again, both reformist parties or moderate parties and hardline parties are asking for the U.S. to exit, whether immediately or over time, but definitely to have a smaller footprint. And when that happens, we continue to see, it is in the best interest of militias, it's in the best interest of the Peshmerga, for there to be some sort of instability in the Sunni areas, because it validates militia presence, it validates foreign interference, it validates Iran's presence. It allows Maliki and now Abadi, who's been asked, hey, declare a security situation so you get to stay in place long enough to twist some arms to form government. And these are the issues that we don't get right because we're constantly looking at the 50-meter target and not looking at what's coming.
This is actually a great way to set up one of the last two questions that I had, although in the reverse order, which is I wanted, before we open the floor to the audience, to ask about the Trump administration's policy and the U.S. policy in general, where you're saying that you want to somehow prevent, 20-year-old Iraqis down the line from having to fight in wars, or for that matter, for Americans to be sent back for another war. President Trump has made clear that he's not interested in state building. He does not want to get involved. He wants to bring our boys home. But when we have evidence of a resurgence of a group like ISIS, what is the solution then? If not an American presence, then what?
The issue here is it's interesting because we're getting into campaign bumper sticker mode now, where the president can say the economy's on the rise, ISIS is defeated, I walked away from a terrible Iran deal, and we're getting out of Syria. The president has also told his national security team, at least he did under the McMaster era, do not give me my own war in the Middle East. Well, you don't get to say that because your enemies get to choose whether or not we're involved. And the reason I say that is Obama didn't want his war in Iraq and got it. The Trump administration doesn't want their war in Afghanistan, and they have it. We don't get to decide. American interest will continue to push us there as long as we have allies, as long as there are resources that are international interests, and as long as governments invite us in. Right now, we're looking at a situation where the president's gonna have to think about this very hard. He criticized Obama for leaving Iraq and said because Obama left Iraq, ISIS came back. At the same time, the president's saying that ISIS is 98% defeated and wanting to leave Syria and wanting to get out of Iraq. He runs the risk in 2020 of being in the position he criticized Obama for, leaving too soon and allowing the resurgence. And the thing is, we're already seeing metrics and indicators that ISIS is back.
Well, and not just that, but also opening opportunities for others to step in. Iran has formed an alliance with the Russians in, well, a quasi-alliance with the Russians in Syria. So why not let the Russians come in and do what the Americans don't want to do? And is that a risk as well?
Well, there's a defense pact.
It doesn't have to be just the Russians, sorry. But
there's intelligence sharing. There's joint operations between Russian forces. Moscow, Baghdad, Tehran, and Damascus have an intelligence sharing program. They also have the underpinnings of a defense pact. We've seen the Russians try to sell the Iraqis S-400s. That's a U.S. red line. We now see that they're selling them to Turkey. They're there to protect against a Western strike on Iranian nuclear facilities. They're not there to protect Qasem Soleimani's offensive operations against Israel and Syria, something that surprised Qasem Soleimani when Israel was able to conduct a 6-hour airstrike and set back his infrastructure 3 years. So there are a lot of things that are happening there. And again, like you said, the Kurds are looking towards the strongest tribe. The Sunnis in Ramadi, I talked to Sunni tribal leaders in Ramadi that said, we're going to pick the strongest horse, and the strongest horse is Iran. We're not going to pick you because you're wavering. And they even said, we're even willing to talk to the Russians, and we've seen that happen. We've seen that with our traditional Gulf allies. The Egyptians, all the way from the Egyptians to Israel, court Russia because they see Russia as a main player in the Middle East now as the U.S. continues to back out. The biggest problem we have is as soon as we get into something, we automatically tell everyone when we're leaving. And what that fails to do is build trust and build commitment with the force you're working with to do very difficult things. Trust is based on frequency and proximity. The more you see me, the more you can reach out and touch me, the more trust is built. But if I come and ask you to do very difficult things, pit yourself against Iran, pit yourself against ISIS, pit yourself against these forces, and I'm leaving in 6 months, you weigh your options. You say, I'll do just so much while you're here, but I'm not going to put myself in a situation where you have a permanent enemy like the Taliban in Afghanistan, or you have a permanent influence, now a growing influence in Iran with a political party tied to the IRGC Quds Force that came in second in Iraq's politics.
And while a lot of Iraqis, like you said, are too young to remember the Saddam Hussein era, they're not too young to remember the invasion of 2003.
Exactly.
And so that's an issue that needs some time, I guess, is what you're saying to get over. Bilal, you were scribbling some notes. Did you want to jump in here? Or?
No, I just wrote what Mike said.
Right.
Trust depends on proximity and frequency. I like that.
I mean, do either of you feel like there are opportunities for other players to step in?
I'll just say one sentence here that Russia is already stepping into the KRG. They bought the export pipeline.
Sure. Well, and also in Basra. Every time I stayed in a hotel in Basra, I'd hear Russian spoken in the hotels.
That's good.
It's everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And not just Russia, other players too, particularly China, because right now Iran is trying to encourage China to make Iran as part of its Road and Belt Initiative and use Iran and also Iraq and Syria all the way to as a route to Eastern Mediterranean. Whenever we talk about this Iranian land bridge,
it sounds better when it's called a Silk Road.
Yeah, the military implications of that. But Iran sees that also as just as an economic route. So it wants to bring China as well. And I agree with Mike that disengaging from Iraq at this critical time would jeopardize all the security and counterterrorism gains of the past 3 and 4 years. And also it will it will also undermine the Trump administration's strategy of, or at least it's saying that it's pushing back against Iranian expansionism in the region, because the more stable Iraq is, the more strong and independent security and political institution it has, the less the Iranian influence there will be. Right now, the Trump administration's policy is narrowly focused on counterterrorism, and also when it comes to the political issues, it's about just making sure that Prime Minister Abadi wins a second term. It needs to have a plan B in case if Abadi does not win, because he's already been weakened. And also it has to think long term, just beyond ISIS, to make sure that its strategic interests in that country are secured in the long term.
Sure, go ahead.
Just one quick follow-up. I think we run the risk of we'll be making a mistake if Prime Minister Abadi simply becomes the Prime Minister and saying all is well in Iraq.
Yeah.
Qasem Soleimani was able to do everything he wanted to do.
I didn't want to say
under Abadi's tenure. And the one thing that I would say about Iranian influence in Iraq, they're so comfortable that they are now training Houthis in Iraq, in Karbala, to conduct attacks in Yemen. They've trained Bahraini militias in Iraq to foment sectarian violence in Bahrain. That's how comfortable they are. Again, if we had this ability to see this as intelligence officers in 2007, we would have targeted it. We would have attacked it. We would have put pressure on Baghdad to do it. But you're opening storefront offices in Baghdad. You have a Houthi office next to the Al Rashid Hotel, the main hotel in Baghdad. Is it the presidential one? And then you have another one. Yeah, the Khorasan group is there. And you can't have that level of storefront terrorist organizations. I mean, again, maybe not designated yet, but in the process of being designated, or at least being argued to be designated. That out in the open. And that's what we have now with Kitab Hezbollah, with Asab al-Haq, with Harakat Najeba. You have that. And again, like you said earlier, Qasem Soleimani can walk the streets of Baghdad and not even worry about anything.
Yeah, but in some ways, I think that the administration should also encourage involvement of regional countries in Iraq, particularly in Iraq's reconstruction.
Can you repeat that, Ahmad, of what they should encourage?
Encourage regional countries to become more involved in Iraq,
right,
and bolster the relations there, and also particularly in the economy. Because the more diversified Iraq's economy is and its trade and commercial ties with regional countries, the less dependent it would be on Iran. Because right now that the Trump administration wants Iraq to strictly enforce all the new sanctions on Iran, it is very much difficult for the Iraqi government, because it depends to a great deal on Iran when it comes to electricity, to gas and food stuff. But if it has better relations with regional countries, particularly the Gulf states, then it will be less reliant and less vulnerable to Iranian dictation and also influence there too.
We'd like to see an Iraq that has a relationship with Iran like we have with Canada and Mexico. The Islamic Republic of Mexico does not have primacy over our security forces. The Islamic Republic of Canada does not decide who our president is. So we'd like to trade goods. We'd like to see that kind of relationship with Iran, but I don't buy in the argument that just because Iran is a neighbor that we have this situation.
Yeah, but it needs to be a balanced relations, because right now there is about 12 billion trade between the two countries, but that's completely disproportionately in favor of Iran. There is about 6 billion non-oil goods coming to Iraq, but the level of Iraqi exports into Iran is just a mere a few millions. So while the cheap Iranian foodstuff which comes to Iraq, that helps partly Iraq, but at the same time that cripples and stifles the local business and local communities. And also, whether it's water issue, whether it's energy issue, Tehran has at times used as a leverage to seek political concessions. So that's why I think that, yeah, the more stable, the stronger Iraq is, and the more it has relations with different regional countries, including Turkey, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and others, then they will have a more kind of balanced and healthy relationship with Iran. Of course, they will always have relations. They share 1,500 kilometers. They both are Shiite majority countries. There are historical ties between the two countries and people, and there should be, but it needs to be a healthy.
They shouldn't pick presidents, and they shouldn't have primacy over a sovereign state security forces.
We have about 1 minute left, and I just want to ask, before I open to questions, I just want to ask to be sure, what about the re-implementation of sanctions by Washington on Iran? How is that going to influence Iran? Not just its influence on Iraq, but the whole region.
I'll take a 1 minute answer to that, then maybe half a minute, and then leave the rest time. I think it would. There is some wishful thinking in believing that Iraq is going to simply say yes to American demands when it comes to implementing sanctions on Iran, because Iran has the ability to sabotage the Iraqi economy, especially the oil infrastructure in the south.
Mm-hmm. Ahmad, did you want to say something on that?
Yeah, just going beyond Iraq. Iraq is important because Iran and Afghanistan could become the unintended casualty of these sanctions. And both countries, they have very weak economy and they are in conflict situation. But other regional countries would also not abide by the US sanctions completely. Mm-hmm. We see, for example, China and India, they will continue to import Iranian oil. Although South Korea, Japan, and many European countries would significantly reduce that. So in India, for example, they have elections coming up. The Indian rupee is dropping. So it would be difficult for them to do it just at once. And right now, both Afghanistan and Iraq, they are trying to lobby with the administration here to give them some exemptions, that all these sanctions should not just apply right away. They should give them some time to accommodate that and to work other alternative routes to meet their demands. Because if that happens just right away, that completely crippled the economies of both countries.
It'll be interesting to see what Brian Hook's Iran task force looks at when it comes to looking at countries that are affected by U.S. sanctions on Iran, and also how to put pressure on those countries to not violate U.S. sanctions. Again, the disconnect between governments and the private sector. The private sector hears the whispers coming out of OFAC and U.S. Treasury, and they say, we're not going to do it, despite their government saying, go ahead and test it, go ahead and go in and do it.
But I'm sure, Mike, you have seen that when you were in Iraq under the sanction of the Obama administration, that it's not just a illicit trade between the two countries. Right. For example, you sanctioned the Iraqi Central Bank.
I'm okay with fruit, gas, electricity.
There is also illicit network and the expansion of an increasing role of the Popular Mobilization Forces that helps that IRGC's illicit network to do that. Right. And also, even if the problem for the administration here is that even if they give exemptions to certain things, even targeted sanctions become more difficult, because most of these economic projects that Iran has in those companies, even if they are under the guise of being private companies, they have affiliation with the IRGC. Mm-hmm. So they would be somehow targeted by the US administration one day or another, so that makes it more difficult.
I guess the theme of our panel is that it's complicated, basically. I'm sorry, but we're going to open the floor to questions now. I ask, please, that you ask a question, and let's keep it brief so we can get as many as possible. And so I will start right here. Sir?
Check. Thanks so much to the panel. My name is Cam Erickson. Dr. Wahab, good to see you, as always. And my question is that relations with Turkey and the United States have really hit an all-time low. The lira is really taking a hit. It seems to be way down. How do you see this impacting relations with the KRG and the KDP and also other Iraqi parties as a whole?
The lira, any of you, just jump in.
Iraq and the KRG, when it comes to the economy, they're basically price takers being influenced. They don't have much of a toolkit to really deal with larger events that go on in the neighborhood. Because as long as the Iraqi government continues to sell oil and oil prices are high and therefore more dollars are coming in, that lower exchange rate could be in Iraq's interest in the short term. But if the Turkish economy, or for that matter, the Iranian economy, is going to be crippled by these sanctions or by a weak lira, which perhaps results in lower productivity, then the Iraqi economy, basically for basic food, is dependent on imports of foodstuffs from Turkey and from Iran, and therefore in the long term, having two unstable neighbors is going to definitely have spillover. Is going to spill over into Iraq and the KRG economy as well.
Yeah.
Thanks to the panel. My name is Li Yang. I just try to get a feeling of what's the difference. They say that Iraq system and American system, the elections is whether there's difference. If you want to evaluate the economy, sometimes that's very misleading, just a GDP. Then, you have a higher employment rate, but if the people are hired to do the corruption things, that's disservice. So I just wonder, can the system have some change different from America? So you have a pick up something with quality and capability to lead the society forward. Although maybe GDP is lower, but actually
so is there some way to incorporate American?
Maybe it's sort of different from American. I want to have a system they have established trustworthy, so people can have a happy life rather than being ripped off once you have the whole life effort to build some of your wealth.
So the Constitution and the rule of law. The Constitution is often shelved. We've seen that. And the rule of law, that we're good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
The Constitution and the rule of law are things that the Iraqi government uses when it benefits them and shelves when it does not. And that's one of the biggest problems. And that's why you see the youth protests in the South, the 80% of the country dissatisfied with the continuation of these political parties. Based on your question, that fairness, that economic opportunity, they're not seeing it because absent a rule of law and a constitution that people actually adhere to, you get corruption. So the only way to really do things is through corruption. You get two in the second row there.
Yep, sir. Right here.
Paul, you. Mike's coming to you. And then next down.
Hi, Paul Davis, Janice Think. Well, I like your concept that the Kurds are bystanders now and not kingmakers. But my question is, based on a couple of recent activities, one is the United States just broke ground in Erbil to build the single largest consulate the U.S. has in the world. Iraq is now talking about putting a customs border between Baghdad and Erbil. And the Iraqis and the Turks have just talked about opening up another border crossing with Turkey that does not have anything to do with the KRG or the Kurds to bypass all of that. Where does that leave the Kurds as far as getting involved in a government in Baghdad or trying to build an international consensus for Kurdish independence?
The Kurdish independence agenda has received a serious blow with the referendum and the aftermath of the referendum, because before the referendum and before October 16 of 2017 last year, there were a lot of questions of what will happen if, right? There were all of these if questions. What will happen if the Kurds go for independence? What will happen if the people vote for independence? What will happen? What will Turkey do? What will Iran do? What will Iraq do? What will the United States' reaction would be? Now we know. And the answers are not in KRG's favor. However, I'm not at least seeing much of reflection on this in the KRG because the Kurds realize that the only stable thing about the Middle East is instability. So they're just going to stick around and wait. And you hear Kurdish leaders basically say, "We did this; it was the right thing to do. The circumstances are not in our favor. No one likes this. But hey, just wait and see. It's like London weather; it may change. Maybe exactly. So maybe not today, maybe not this generation. In fact, the president the other day the president of KDP said, maybe not this generation, maybe not the next generation, but the one after it will see the results of this referendum. Of course, it's a luxury to be able to make that kind of statements, but that just tells you the attitude of the Kurdish leadership that this referendum was the right thing to do, and it will pay off some time. What worries me, let me just talk for myself, is that with this attitude, then we're not going to have projects that will result in better cooperation on issues in areas where cooperation with Baghdad is necessary. I mean, I mentioned cooperation being necessary over the security gap in Kirkuk and the disputed territories. Baghdad cannot maintain security alone. KRG cannot maintain security alone. They need to do it together. If the KRG attitude is still independence and eyeing the exit door, then there is less incentive for the KRG to go and talk to Baghdad. And if Baghdad basically sees the KRG as still eyeing the door, then they don't have many reasons to actually trust the KRG on the other hand. I mean, that trust factor is going to be very important. This also applies to the neighbors. I think when Turkey and Iran deal with, and for the matter of the United States, deal with the KRG, they will be more careful about empowering the KRG if the KRG's goal is going to be independence, because what's true today is probably going to, in the eyes of Washington, Tehran, and Ankara, will also be true in 20 years, because it was true 20 years ago. And so that is what I'm not sure how the future is going to be any better than the present and the past, because the attitude in Baghdad is one of victory, we crushed them, we defeated them, rather than let's make this work. And the attitude in Kurdistan is this was a setback, not a defeat. So we're going to start this, we're going to start over, we're going to start again. Maybe not me, maybe my family, maybe my party will start again. So I'm very doubtful about this relationship working. So I mentioned Kirkuk security, and I also mentioned, the other issue is the question of revenue sharing, looking at the economy, coming up with win-win solutions to managing, for example, Kirkuk's oil. Right now, believe it or not, there is 300,000 barrels of Kirkuk oil that is being shut in and not seeing the international markets. Why? Because the only way out of that for that oil is through the Kurdish pipeline, and Baghdad says, I'm not going to use Kurdish pipeline because that's a sign of concession. So at the time that Iran is being sanctioned and perhaps oil markets is going to be destabilized by some 1 million barrels of 2 million barrels of Iranian oil probably not seeing the market, that 300,000 is a lot of leverage that the Iraqi and the Kurdish government have, but petty politics, sometimes personality issues and personal issues come into the way of achieving win-win solutions. And the political atmosphere also of elections, both in KRG and elections in Baghdad and government formation, it's all about arm twisting, it's all about winning and scoring points rather than achieving the kind of goals and results that the public are on the street protesting for.
Yeah, that dynamic could change if this government becomes a very hostile government towards the United States. That dynamic could change pretty quickly.
The gentleman in the back. We have time for like one or two more questions.
Namo Abdullah with Rudao Media Network. So I have a question about the former ambassador to Turkey and Iraq. James Jeffrey was just sworn in as the United States Special Representative to Syria. So what can you read into that? Does that mean we are entering like a post-ISIS phase in Syria? And what does it mean to Iraq as well? Thanks.
Well, he was on this panel, actually. We had this panel about 45 days ago, 2 months ago. And he's very aware of the potential for ISIS resurgence in both Iraq and Syria, and very concerned about creeping Iranian influence in both countries. I think it's a great post, but I'll let you go into it since you told me about it this morning.
I think it's this administration paying greater attention to Syria. Obviously, you cannot work on Syria in isolation from the countries where Ambassador Jeffrey has served in the past. I hope that this is a sign that this administration is finally putting its act together when it comes to having a clear Syria policy, because Ambassador Jeffrey is a very serious diplomat, a very serious mediator as well, as we in Iraq know. On the one hand, he's a realist. He goes in with both eyes wide open. Second, and again, to stabilize Syria, then the United States needs to work with Iraq, with Turkey, and obviously with Russia, with Iran, and since we're talking about Iraq and this panel is about Iraq, I think one area where Iraq has been at a disadvantage is that Iraq policy has been seconded to an Iran policy where the focus is solely on sanctions, or an ISIS policy where the focus has been mainly on security and military. But I think by focusing, by having Ambassador Jeffrey in charge of the Syria dossier, he will have that holistic view and that comprehensive view of looking at politics, security, ISIS resurgence, but also his knowledge of politics in Iraq and politics in Turkey. I hope that Iraq will also be able to, Iraq policy will be able to be a standalone policy rather than second to some other secondary policy.
And now Brett McGurk doesn't have to do everything. So that's
exactly. That was the point that I wanted to make. And also one of his key tasks would be about the political processes in Syria, because right now, of course, Turkey, Iran, and Russia, they have taken the initiative through the Astana process. They're leading all those efforts, and the Geneva process is almost dead. So I think that he would be tasked to re-energize that and bring kind of more international consistent efforts for any kind of political settlement and also political future of Syria, although I personally am not very optimistic about that prospect.
Sadly, we've run out of time. We need a week to scratch the surface on Iraqi issues, but I really appreciate all of you being here, and thanks to Mike and Bilal and Ahmed for their great discussion.
Thank you. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you very much, everyone.